Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah. Oh, okay. I can do that. Sorry. Just sort of. All right. Well, let's try that. Hope everyone's doing okay. It's always a pleasure to be back speaking to you. So our first reading this morning, to kind of kick things off, it's a short excerpt from Abraham Lincoln's address before the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society in September of 1859. As Lincoln speeches go, this is not, one of his A-listers. It's not a phenomenally well-known one, and frankly, it's not a very good one by Lincoln's lofty standards, but I did like what he had to say about education, so I wanted to start off with that. The old general rule was that educated people did not perform manual labor. They did manage to eat their bread, but left the toil of producing it to the uneducated. This was not an insurmountable evil to the working bees, so long as the class of drones remained very small. But now, especially in these states, nearly all are educated, quite too nearly all, to leave the labor of the uneducated in any ways adequate to the support of the whole. It follows from this that henceforth educated people must labor. Otherwise, education itself would become a positive and intolerable evil. No country can sustain in idleness more than a small percentage of its numbers. The great majority must labor at something productive. From these premises, the problem springs. How can labor and education be the most satisfactorily combined? The thought recurs that education, cultivated thought, can best be combined with agricultural labor or any other labor on the principle of thorough work, that careless, half-performed, slovenly work makes no place for such combination, and thorough work, again, renders sufficient the smallest quantity of ground to each man. And this, again, conforms to what must occur in a world less inclined to wars and more devoted to the arts of peace than heretofore. Population must increase rapidly, more rapidly than in former times, and ere long, the most valuable of all arts will be the art of deriving a comfortable subsistence from the smallest area of soil. No community whose members possesses this art can ever be the victim of oppression in any of its forms. Such community will be alike independent of crowned kings, money kings, and land kings. So when I read these remarks, it got me thinking. I was just getting ready to leave for Greece when Iris asked me to do this, and it didn't occur to me to think, well, I'll be getting back 2 days after that, I'll be exhausted. I pushed that aside and thought, well, I'll think about something to discuss. And I thought, well, this fall is the 170th anniversary of the dedication of the cornerstone of Christian University, now Culver Stockton College. And I spent a big chunk of my life talking about the history of the college. My own personal research is about the history of the college. I'm a college historian. So I thought that would be a good subject to discuss. But the challenge that I have in discussing this topic is I kind of come at it with my two different hats. On the one hand, I'm the college historian, and when I discuss college history, it tends to be positive. It tends to have a good, happy ending. When I'm writing my own research as someone whose specialty, background training is in the history of race relations and slavery and abolition, I'm sort of trained to pick that story apart and go for the more depressing sides of the story and complicate the story. And those two things are kind of in tension. And lately, with our climate of challenges to education and debates about the role or even appropriateness of higher education in our society, I started to think, well, maybe it's okay to have my college historian hat on and celebrate this story a little bit and maybe leave the complicating aside for now. So that was my plan for this morning. So in the fall of 1853, the first telegraph was used in the United States at the Merchants Exchange in San Francisco. Antoinette Blackwell became the first U.S.-born woman to be ordained a minister in a mainstream Protestant denomination. The Otis Elevator Company started, and this might sound familiar, famous attention-seeking, ultra-rich tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt famously completed his first circumnavigation of the globe in his yacht. So rich guys were doing that stuff back then, too. In Canton, Missouri, on September 14th, 1853 specifically, between 1,500 and 3,000 people crowded on the hill, that small hill, for one of the biggest celebrations in the town's history. The fledgling town of Canton had only been in its second year of incorporation then, and it looked to the future with great enthusiasm. It had been battling with its rival just to the north, the city of, the north, the city of Tully, which was Canton's chief rival until it was wiped out by a flood in 1851, leaving Canton sort of the unquestioned dominant force in that part of the river. By 1853, the town was inching toward 2,000, and it was eager to send a signal that it was on the move. And they found that signal in the cornerstone celebration for the new Christian university. That day, an army of people gathered there on the hill. And back then, the hill consisted of nothing but 2 farmhouses about where the Johann Library currently sits. And that was really it. And they gathered there for an extensive celebration that included music, political speeches, religious messages, a parade, several performances by the renowned choir, the Columbians from Columbia, Missouri, and then 2 eagerly anticipated keynote addresses, one by famous Christian church minister Jacob Creeth Jr., and the other by University of Missouri President James Shannon, a very well-known figure in Northeast Missouri, who himself was one of the founding trustees of the university. A number of notable personages were in attendance that day, according to newspaper accounts, including Michigan Senator and future Secretary of State Lewis Cass, Illinois Congressman and close Lincoln pal Orville Browning, Monticello, Missouri State Senator, soon-to-be U.S. Senator James Green, and any number of known and notable Campbell Stone movement ministers. The honorary marshal for that day was Monticello's Chauncey Durkee, well known in this region as a businessman, militia general, and one of the region's earliest settlers. It was Durkee that had sold the original 34 acres of the college, soon to be 58, that became the original university on quite favorable terms. Many of you also know Durkee as the enslaver of Charlie, the enslaved person who ran away to Richard Eel's house. The cornerstone ceremony itself was performed by Canton's Masonic Lodge number 100, and the master of ceremonies that day was the university's principal founder and guiding spirit, the Reverend D. Pat Henderson, a man who is kind of a personal hero of mine. His portrait hangs outside of my office in the history department. And it was his vision that was triumphing that day in Canton. A platform was set up about 20 feet to the east of the original building's foundation, and everyone gathered for a huge celebration. We have no photos from that day. There's no photos that I know of the university at all before it was constructed. I would love to find one. The founding of the university was a victory in a larger effort by various American denominations, including the Campbell Stone movement, to expand American education. Henderson, Creeth, and Shannon all belonged to the Campbell Stone movement, and in a nutshell, without going off on a side trip, their movement was most interested in promoting, I would say, 3 things. One, what they called the open table, so a version of Christianity that was free of barriers of sect and divisions, and a general kind of everyone's welcome, let's focus on core principles and not get sidetracked kind of approach. Second, they espoused what they called primitive Christianity. They didn't want elaborate doctrines or creeds, which again they thought as barriers separating believers as opposed to forces that united them. And then third and finally, education. They were utterly convinced that education, higher education in particular, was going to be a powerful force in making sure that morality and Republican democracy migrated west along with the American Republic. So this was a story of very, very different men, and they all were men at the beginning, coming together around a common commitment to faith and to education. As James Shannon himself declared in his address that day on the Hill, the site which you have selected is one of unsurpassed loveliness, preeminently fitted by the nature to be the site of a great literary institution. It is central not merely to the great and growing states of Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois, but eventually to all states now existing or yet to be erected within the Great Valley. With that blessing thus sought, and thus obtained, Friends of Christian University, you need not tear the combined powers of earth and hell leagued against you. Their opposition, though malignant, will yet be impotent. They essentially shared Abraham Lincoln's vision, the idea that education, excellent education, should not be limited, and that everyone should have access to that regardless of their class position and their means. Lincoln saw agriculture, as he mentioned in another portion of the address in Wisconsin, agriculture, quote, is an opportunity for cultivating thought. Every blade of grass is a study, and to produce two where there was but one is both a profit and a pleasure. The founders of Christian University, like Lincoln, rejected what was then called the mudsill theory, the idea that society depended upon the existence of an upper class and a lower class to support it, and there must be barriers in between those. The founders and Lincoln all shared the idea that that idea was nonsense. What's interesting is that is about all they shared in terms of political ideas. These founders were very, very different individuals. Yet, despite their political differences, they founded an egalitarian, open university that's goal was to open access to education. They secured a charter from the state of Missouri early in 1853, and before that charter was even dry, Henderson had the idea that, the original charter is not adequate. The original vision was to have the university cater to male students, primarily that would be interested in becoming educated and possibly going into the ministry. Henderson decided that was too narrow, and he met with the other founders, and they decided, no, we need to be expressly for coeducation. So at a time when that was a rarity, they asked the state to revise the charter, and they publicly declared their intention that this university would be co-ed. As Shannon himself declared, "You will discover that we include our daughters in this union. The time has passed when it will be thought necessary to teach females merely to read and write their names, and that will be sufficient for them. If any distinction is to be made between our sons and daughters in their education, then give the females the preference, because of the disadvantages they lie under, and because of the great agency they exercise in the formation of the minds of men. The language of our country is educate your children, especially your daughters." The university they envisioned would bring excellent education to an expanding group of people. But the challenge of diving into this story and then just focusing on the positives is that these men did have very different political beliefs, and then those beliefs would be severely challenged by the approach of the Civil War and the war itself. For example, Jacob Creeth, the renowned DOC minister, Campbell Stone minister, excuse me, the DOC is more of a modern term. He was asked to give the opening remarks. And his comments were a bit somber, but extremely optimistic. He declared, "Never before did the citizens of this place assemble to witness and celebrate the laying of the cornerstone of an institution of learning, in which not only your sons and your daughters are to be educated, but their sons and daughters, and their generations yet unborn in other states." The future looked bright, and Creeth thought the institution would provide a valuable service. But that would be severely tested in the years looking ahead. It's worth mentioning how diverse the founders were. D. Pat Henderson was an abolitionist. When he lived in Jacksonville, Illinois in the 1840s, he published one of Jacksonville's earliest abolitionist newspapers. James Shannon was one of his best friends, and he was a former slave owner and also one of the country's most famous defenders of slavery. Jacob Creeth was a unionist who was sympathetic to slavery because his family owned slavery, but he ultimately believed that religion and things like education would hold us together. And then the war and the challenges of the breakdown of sectional harmony is going to severely test all of that. So you can't really tell the story of education in Christian University without then talking about this negative story of how it almost falls apart and how the different founders had different orientations towards slavery. So that's kind of the conundrum that I am in. And in some respects, this is a story with no happy ending. I'll mention Jacob Creeth, for example. A little over 9 years after Jacob Creeth's remarks, where he talked about the bright future of Northeast Missouri, that education would save us, He was contacted by military officials in Palmyra and told that a number of Confederate prisoners were going to be executed, and asked if he would be with them the night before and pray with them and provide spiritual comfort. So it was Jacob Creeth who was asked to provide final prayers over the victims of the Palmyra massacre when they were executed in 1862. The war years would kind of radicalize Creeth. He lost his stomach for Union during the war, and by the end of the war years, he supported secession and was a much more radical political figure than he had been prior to the war. James Shannon didn't even make it to the war. He eventually gets fired by the University of Missouri for his radical political preaching and finds a job in Canton as the first president of Christian University. Shannon dies in 1859 from a stroke, unaware of the war to come and the role that he played in that war, and unaware that Christian University itself would not survive the war, at least in its original form. So the challenge of studying this moment for me is to focus on the positive story and remember that the place has been there for 170 years, so that vision of open access to education is there, despite the fact that there's also this story at the very beginning that is intrinsically bound to race and slavery. Despite the praise from the press and from the religious community in America, and there was quite a bit, one of my favorites was a very powerful editorial in the Louisville Journal that praised D. Pat Henderson and the new university. The editor of that paper declared, "Henderson's labors of love toward the human race have not only been in the earnest, sincere, and ennobling character that belong to true-hearted men, but they have been highly appreciated by the people of Missouri. His object is so commendable, the purpose so great, and Mr. Henderson has such capacity for winning the love and confidence of all who form his acquaintance, that we look upon the endowment of Christian University as one of the certainties of the future. For he that gives toward securing education, accompanied by religion, does much to perpetuate republican institutions and secure the public welfare and happiness of the people. There is no other investment that can secure such permanent and substantial blessings." But those blessings weren't permanent, of course. As the 1850s wore on and as the sectional crisis grew worse, hard times would hit Christian University. By the time we reached about 1858, the university had invested about 70% of its endowment in the Southern Pacific Railroad. That railroad ceased to exist once the Civil War existed, wiping out much of the endowment. Shortly before the war started, Northern support for higher education in slave states began to dry up. I've found a letter in our archives from the president of Eureka College to Henderson saying, "Good luck with your new enterprise, really appreciate your reaching out to me, but we won't be supporting any institutions in slave states." So the world was kind of narrowing because of these political options. And eventually, the university would all but close when the war started. Henderson returned to work as a minister in Kentucky, spent the war years serving as a nurse and a volunteer for the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Jacob Creeth would serve as a nurse and minister throughout the war years. At war's end, the founders returned to Canton and began to discuss how to rebuild. Henderson, the guiding spirit, would watch as the financial collapse of the institution led us to close between 1861 and 1866. And eventually, the institution would reopen, but it was with a mostly new cast of trustees, and the funding and financing that had started originally was all gone because of the war. So the interesting question here is this moment of celebration in the fall of 1853, which for D. Pat Henderson was about his belief that Christian unity, education, in support of the Republic, could solve all of our problems. He anticipated the sectional crisis could be overcome through that. He anticipated that all of our problems could be overcome with just enough unity. And interestingly enough, the university survived the war, but D. Pat Henderson's ideas were deeply, deeply shaken, I think. So to me, this is where sort of the takeaway maybe is. I don't know if I have a takeaway, frankly, but if I do have one, it's in here somewhere. Despite the political differences of the founders, despite the closure to the war, even the disciples of Christ Church itself would split in 1906, which was probably as much of a byproduct of the sectional crisis in the war as anything. So Henderson's original premise that unity could overcome these divisions was proven wrong. So on the one hand, we look at this and we think, wow, this is not a happy ending to this story. But on the other hand, this institution has been around for 170 years. I think about the joyful tone of Canton's Northeast Reporter the day after the Cornerstone celebration. Canton's newspaper back then declared, "We are highly gratified at the prospects of this institution. To our town is it of greater importance than any other local object or enterprise. To the county, it is the source of pride and exaltation that does not exist in the state of Missouri, but with one exception. The whole community is interested in its prosperity. The philanthropist can have his feelings gratified in promoting the cause of education. All other earthly acquisitions are transitory and evanescent. Wealth of knowledge cannot be taken away or be taxed. The young who is thirsting for knowledge or that wealth of wisdom that is better than gold can always be satisfied at Christian University." Now, fast forward to September 14th, 1869, the 16th anniversary of that Cornerstone ceremony. The aging D-Pat Henderson was invited back to Canton to provide some reflections on his years in Canton and what the university meant. And that address is an interesting mix of Henderson clearly being sad about what happened, how the disciples split, how the war was not prevented, and how the university almost closed. But he also ends with a very positive note that kind of reminded me maybe there's time to focus on the 170 years of an institution pushing toward expanding education and don't always focus on the more negative and complicated story. Henderson noted, "A black and gloomy cloud arose with the war and settled ruinously over Christian University. But God has changed the dogs of war, rolled back the thickening clouds, and once more set his loving smiles upon his sighing children. I urge the citizens of Canton to stand by your university and those who uphold it, and to be nobly generous and liberally benevolent by showing facts and figures that this university is worth more to the town than all their railroads and everything else. The future of Canton is bright." So most of the founders were gone. The original university was in many ways gone. The original bell of the institution, which was emblazoned with the logo Christian University, proclaiming Christian liberty to the entire world, cracked in 1869 and they had to replace it. So it did seem like there was some negatives going on. But the university remained a force for expanding access to education in the region. And despite the division in the church, divisions in the community, and in the country, Christian University would endure. And today, 170 years later, it still survives. So for me, this is the important reminder. There's certainly a time to tell the complicated and challenging story of Christian University and its connection to race and slavery and the Civil War, and that is a story I am trying to tell. But I also think it's important that from time to time, we stop and remember the good. And in this case, it's 170 years of an institution of higher learning. So perhaps the story isn't just, well, if you look back at the beginning, the story gets pretty complicated and icky. Maybe the story is, despite its origins in this complicated and tricky world of slavery, secession, sectionalism, and war, that the institution of higher learning for 170 years had survived. That common commitment that united people as different as Lincoln, Shannon, Henderson, and Creeth is still with us, and perhaps it can survive any other modern challenge that we throw at it as well. So that's my story. So thank you.